Hi, I'm David Adams. I'm your instructor for the Project Management course. And with today's lecture, we'll continue with adding project activities. Specifically, we'll look at risk assessment. When we initially did the work breakdown structure, we were looking for 100% of the work completed. But in reality, we only captured probably 98%. The other 2% usually comes from the risk assessment. We will learn what it is and how it impacts the project. Come with me to learn about project risk assessment. With this lecture, we'll look at adding a risk plan or a risk assessment. We'll first review the plan the project phase, and then we'll look at the specifics for adding a risk plan. That is, what is the process? What are the resulting actions? How do you calculate risk rating? And look specifically at our case study. And then, of course, we'll finish with best practices. In the plan the project phase, there are adding project activities which require looking at 5 different plans. With this lecture, we'll cover the risk plan. That is, how are we going to create a project risk assessment? So what is a risk assessment? It's a process to identify any possible hazards, completing a risk analysis, and completing an evaluation for possible future actions. Now, I know I said 100% of the work was captured in the work breakdown structure, but it's probably only 98%. The other 2% comes from project activities, especially from the risk assessment exercise. So in creating a risk register, you need to go through a 5-step risk assessment process. And this should be started after you completed your first project schedule. Step 1 is assembling all your subject matter experts. And you want to assemble all the people who are experts, team members, people outside the team, anyone who could identify hazards that could impact the project. Next, a facilitator should brainstorm all the potential risks, even if they seem far-fetched. List as many as possible so you can make sure that this is a robust project plan. Afterwards, the leader of the meeting will facilitate rating the impact and probability of each potential risk. And it's a group decision whether it's a high, medium, or low type of risk. In a risk register, there's usually 4 types of risk assessment actions. There's the all and out, avoid, you stop the project. The risk is too much. Very rarely does that happen, but it does happen. You may choose to accept, which means, do you feel lucky? Will you observe it as a project manager? You may mitigate by taking some sort of action. And lastly, you can transfer the risk by either getting insurance or putting together contract language that will avoid the risk. Let us get into the details of a risk register. Risk rating calculation is impact times probability equals risk rating. In my experience, it's best to rate the risk by low, medium, or high, and assigning a numeric value, low being 1, medium 5, and high equals 9. So for our example, if you had a high impact and a medium probability, that would be 9 times 5, which would equal a 45 risk rating. And if you look at the chart, actions by risk rating score, you would definitely take action in this case and probably mitigate something. These are guidelines, but most find that a score of 1 to 5 equals do nothing, 9 to 25 possible action, probably just observe, in the 45 to 81 range for the risk rating calculation, you probably want to take some action. So back to our case study, Imagine our project team got together and brainstormed 5 possible risks. The first one was, what happens if the third-party marketing supplier does not take the appropriate quality steps, not in line with the project requirements? The second risk is stakeholders are not kept up to date on the latest developments. 3 and 4 apply to something we've already done. It's the fast track actions for product development tasks and the marketing test task. And the 5th risk is unclear roles and responsibility of tasks for the project, and there's confusion which causes delay for completion. Next, the project manager would create a grid with all the possible risks in the first column. In the other 4 columns, he'd put impact, probability, risk rating, and comments and actions. We've just completed the first part of a risk assessment. Next, with a multi-voting type of process, the project manager would facilitate from the group what each impact and probability would be for each possible risk. For instance, for the third-party marketing supplier would not take appropriate quality steps, the impact would be high and the probability would be medium. Typically in a group meeting setting, there will be some debate whether it's high, medium, or low, but it's important to come to some consensus so you can move ahead. After agreement on the high, medium, and low settings for impact and probability, the project manager would assign the appropriate number to each so he can calculate the risk rating. As mentioned before, the risk rating is impact times probability. So for our first risk, we had a high impact and medium probability. 9 times 5 is a 45 rating. The next step is the most important part of the risk register, the actions from the evaluation of the risk assessment. When the group looked at the third-party marketing supplier and saw the 45 rating, they decided they need to transfer the risk. That is, create a statement of work, or SOW, for the supplier, incorporating the quality requirements to make sure that quality is adhered to. With the second possible risk, the risk rating of 25, the group decided to mitigate. That is, having the communication grid with the stakeholders, part of the communication plan, and then add the monthly meetings to the project schedule. So that's a further action which we'll take on in the next unit. The third and fourth possible risk, both fast-track actions on the project schedule, had a 5 and a 9 rating, both in that accept range. That is, the project team will look closely and observe, and if they see something, they'll do it, but there's nothing specifically they need to do in the meantime. And in the last risk, unclear roles and responsibilities had a 45 rating, which means there's a mitigation activity. And we already know we're going to develop a RACI chart later in this unit and communicate it to all the stakeholders so everyone will know what they need to do. And that's it. This chart represents the risk register. Typically, you can do this in 1 to 3 hours, and you may even revisit the next day, but typically you can get it done all at once as long as you have the subject matter experts together. As we've seen thus far, adding project activities is a best practice. Specifically, doing your risk plan, adding a project risk assessment, and you should do it for every project. Gather your subject matter experts to create the register, go through the process, review with the project sponsor, get understanding and agreement, take the necessary tasks to minimize the risk, and incorporate it into your project schedule as required. Until next time.